In the dim corridors of medieval power, where dynasties rose upon the shattered innocence of children, a young girl would ascend to both queen and captive before reaching her 13th year. Isabella of France, later remembered as the she-wolf, began her rule not with celebration, but with a grief she wasn't allowed to express. Her story unveils the ruthless mechanics of medieval politics, where children were traded like currency, and marriages served as tools of political warfare. It was the year 1308. Across the English Channel, preparations were in full swing for a marriage that would alter the fates of two powerful realms. Yet, this was no romantic tale. The bride was barely 12, knew only French, and was terrified of the ocean crossing that would deliver her into a foreign kingdom. Her groom, Edward II of England, was 24, far more interested in his male companions than in fulfilling royal duties with his child bride. Isabella's wedding gown, sewn from golden fabric and adorned with precious metals, weighed nearly as much as she did. Eyewitnesses recounted how she required assistance to walk down the nave of Westminster Abbey, not out of fear, but because of the physical burden of her ornate attire. To those present it was a cruel metaphor, a young girl crushed beneath the very symbols of authority she neither understood nor desired. The wedding itself lasted 4 hours, conducted entirely in Latin, a language Isabella scarcely knew. She stood motionless and silent as high clergy sanctified a union that would go on to shape English politics for half a century. When the crown was set upon her small head, witnesses saw her neck tilt under its weight, a foretelling of the heavy burdens she would carry throughout her life. As bells rang across London to welcome the new queen, Isabella of France was not stepping into glory but falling into a gilded prison. The sheltered French princess was now little more than a strategic asset of the English crown. Her childhood was terminated not by time, but by the weight of a crown she had never wished to bear. The wedding banquet that followed would be her last experience of youthful joy. Seated beside a husband who barely acknowledged her, surrounded by courtiers speaking a language foreign to her, Isabella began to grasp the crushing loneliness that would define her royal existence. No longer a child, but not yet truly a woman, she found herself suspended in the agonizing space of royal girlhood. The wedding night, mercifully brief according to chroniclers, marked the beginning of her brutal education in the reality of medieval queenship. At just 12, she was expected to bear heirs for the English throne while surviving the treacherous labyrinth of court life. Her French attendants were dismissed. Her toys packed away. Her innocence buried beneath layers of protocol and embroidered silk. Medieval royal marriages were strategic weapons, wielded with precision and often cruelty. Children like Isabella were groomed from birth for political leverage. Their future spouses were chosen for military, economic, or territorial advantage, never for love. The human toll of such unions was irrelevant to their political purpose. Talks of Isabella's marriage began when she was scarcely able to walk. French and English envoys spent years negotiating her dowry, debating over territorial exchanges, and drafting the intricate terms of a pact meant to solidify alliances. She was spoken of in the same transactional language used for livestock or land. Her opinions were never considered. King Philip IV of France, her father, saw her marriage as a key pillar in his diplomatic plans. By placing his daughter on the English throne, he aimed to neutralize England as a military threat and potentially sway its foreign policy. To him, Isabella was not a child, she was a strategic weapon, a human key to future influence. Her value exceeded even that of gold or land, for she could birth English monarchs loyal to French interests. The formal marriage contract, now housed in England's royal archives, stands as a testament to the cold precision of medieval diplomacy. It outlines her dowry, household regulations, and even how many French servants she was allowed to keep. The most chilling clauses dictated her personal freedoms. She could not write to her family without English approval, nor could she leave the country without royal consent. Her virginity was to be regularly inspected until the marriage was officially consummated. Edward II's known affections for his male favorite, Piers Gaveston, were no secret at the French court. Philip IV understood his daughter would likely be neglected, but as long as she bore children, this was considered an acceptable cost. Though the age gap between Isabella and Edward was typical for the time, it created a disturbing imbalance. Edward had lived through war and politics, Isabella came from the innocent luxury of a royal nursery. Their union was less a marriage and more a violent collision between hardened adulthood and sheltered childhood. Once her betrothal was formalized, Isabella's preparation began. Tutors drilled her in English customs, law, and noble lineages. She practiced writing in the English style, memorized faces of important courtiers, and was instructed in the complex etiquette of court life. But no one prepared her for the emotional solitude that would engulf her. Westminster Palace, her new home, was a dazzling yet suffocating cage. Though adorned with luxury, the Queen's chambers were crafted more to restrain than to comfort. Her life became a rigid schedule. She rose with the chapel bells, prayed, ate regulated meals, and filled her days with approved, queenly, activities. Reading was allowed, but only from censored books. Music was encouraged, but only if it did not stir her longing for home. Even her letters were subjected to strict surveillance. Each message sent or received was read and evaluated by English officials. Innocent phrases could be censored or twisted into accusations. Even her conversations were not safe, many of her attendants served as informants for the king. Physically, she was isolated as well. Her chambers were sealed behind guards and locked corridors. She could not walk the gardens freely, visit other parts of the palace unchaperoned, or leave the grounds without an official royal escort planned days in advance. Her relationship with Edward was defined by cold distance and occasional cruelty. Obsessed with Gaveston, Edward barely treated Isabella as his wife. He often ignored her entirely, communicating through others even when sitting in the same room. Chroniclers began to notice troubling signs in the once lively young queen. She grew silent, withdrawn, and visibly anxious, biting her nails to bleeding, pulling her hair in ceremonies, and reacting nervously to sounds. Meals became another arena of silent suffering. Though extravagant food was laid before her, she often left it untouched, not due to lack of hunger, but because she knew every bite was watched, every motion judged. In time, she learned to suppress both her appetite and her homesickness, burying her suffering beneath a mask of royal dignity. Among the greatest humiliations of her early reign was the public relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveston. A knight from Gascony, Gaveston's unchecked power scandalized England. His behavior toward Isabella was especially cruel. He mocked her accent, called her the French wench, and humiliated her at public events. At her own coronation banquet, Gaveston flaunted jewelry meant for Isabella, gifts Edward had given him instead. Among them was a ruby necklace custom-made for the queen. Isabella sat beside them, forced to endure her degradation in silence. Gaveston even usurped her ceremonial role. During formal functions, he sat where the queen should. Foreign dignitaries were told to greet him first, rendering Isabella a figurehead in her own court. The nature of Edward and Gaveston's bond was never formally recorded as romantic, but few doubted its intensity. They shared rooms, exchanged intimate gifts, and displayed affection that disturbed even the lax norms of the time. For Isabella, witnessing her husband bestow on another man the affection she longed for was a daily torment. Her irrelevance was made clear at every turn. Her family, horrified by her treatment, attempted diplomatic protests. Her father sent stern letters to Edward demanding better conditions for her, but these efforts only worsened her plight. Edward took them as insults, and Isabella paid the price. Despite the clear discomfort it caused Isabella and the outrage it provoked in foreign courts, there was no suggestion that Edward II should amend his behavior. The scandal surrounding Piers Gaveston taught Isabella hard but invaluable lessons about the realities of power and the mercilessness of court politics. She learned to observe in silence, remember offenses, and prepare herself for future opportunities to retaliate. The humiliation she suffered in these early years became the fuel for her eventual transformation, from powerless child bride to the fierce she-wolf of France, who would one day destroy kings and their favorites alike. Royal child marriage in the Middle Ages followed strict legal and social structures designed with one goal in mind: political advantage. Human well-being, particularly that of girls, was secondary. Isabella's life was a case study in how young girls were shaped into state tools long before they could even understand what was being done to them. Canon law, which governed Christian marriage, technically required mutual consent. But for children like Isabella, that consent was assumed to be granted by their parents or guardians. The idea of informed consent, knowing and agreeing to the implications of marriage, was non-existent in a system where the thoughts and emotions of children were irrelevant. Even the act of consummation was treated as a public concern. Though Isabella's marriage was not consummated until she was considered physically mature, around age 15, this delay brought its own torment. For 3 years, she lived in a liminal state, neither fully child nor fully wife, undergoing regular intrusive medical examinations to confirm her virginity. The medical understanding of the time was archaic and dangerous. Court doctors subjected Isabella to treatments meant to speed up her physical development, herbal concoctions, specialized diets, and other methods that would be seen today as medically harmful. These physical assessments were performed by male physicians in the presence of court officials, turning her body into a public matter and inflicting what today would be clearly understood as systemic abuse. Even the timeline of her pregnancy was dictated by political strategy. Her first child was meant to be conceived at a time that aligned with both favorable astrological predictions and geopolitical developments. When she did not become pregnant immediately, physicians and astrologers were consulted, and her fertility was treated as a matter of national security. Isabella's royal household was built not for comfort but for control. Her English ladies-in-waiting were selected for their loyalty to Edward II, not for their ability to provide emotional support. Her remaining French attendants were dismissed, severing the final ties to her language, homeland, and identity. Her isolation was total, and the psychological toll was immense. In an era with no understanding of trauma or mental health, Isabella's distress was dismissed as feminine frailty or lack of religious devotion. When she exhibited signs of what modern psychology would recognize as depression or anxiety, she was told it stemmed from spiritual weakness or improper conduct. The burden of dynastic motherhood. When Isabella finally became pregnant at age 17, her status at court shifted. No longer just a symbolic queen, she now carried the future of the English monarchy in her womb. But this new importance came with immense pressure. Pregnancy was not a private experience, it was a matter of state. The court kept her condition secret until the 4th month, when movement from the child could be confirmed. Everything she did, what she ate, how much she moved, what she read, was monitored and dictated by physicians who cared more about producing a healthy male heir than protecting her mental or physical well-being. Her successful delivery of a son, the future Edward III, in 1312 briefly elevated her position. She had accomplished her most critical duty as queen. Yet even this triumph brought little personal reward. Her motherhood was tightly controlled by court custom. Royal infants were raised by appointed caretakers, not their parents. Isabella saw her son during ceremonial events or supervised visits, a calculated distance meant to keep maternal emotions from interfering with politics. The pressure to produce more heirs continued relentlessly. Her menstrual cycles were tracked, her fertility managed like a military campaign, and each failed pregnancy, of which there were several, was not just a personal tragedy but a political failure. She was expected to show affection for her children in public while maintaining the detachment required to sacrifice them for dynastic needs. When her infant daughter Joan was betrothed to a Scottish prince, Isabella was expected to smile through the pain, celebrating the political arrangement while privately mourning the loss of another child to royal diplomacy. After Gaveston's execution in 1312, Edward II's attentions turned to a new favorite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. His arrival marked an even darker chapter. If Gaveston was greedy and arrogant, Despenser was manipulative, cruel, and power-hungry. His goal wasn't just wealth or status, he wanted control of the kingdom itself. Using his influence over Edward, Despenser orchestrated the removal of political rivals and created a government that revolved entirely around himself. He reduced Edward to a puppet, and Isabella to a figurehead. Her ceremonial presence at court masked the fact that she had been completely excluded from power. One by one, her French allies and trusted confidants were banished, arrested, or discredited. Despenser made sure she had no one left to turn to. Without support, Isabella began to show signs of deep psychological strain. Her secret attempts to contact her family in France were discovered. Letters intercepted by Despenser were twisted into proof of disloyalty and used to justify even stricter restrictions. Then came the final insult. Edward, on Despenser's advice, seized Isabella's lands, her only source of independent income. Now entirely dependent on the king's allowance, she was a queen in name only. Chroniclers observed the change in her demeanor. Once radiant and confident, she became pale, withdrawn, and visibly shaken. Her nervous behaviors, frequent hand-washing, sudden flinches, and erratic movements, revealed a woman in constant fear. In 1325, Isabella saw her chance. France, now ruled by her brother Charles IV, was threatening war with England over disputed territories. Edward needed someone to negotiate peace. Isabella offered herself, playing the role of the dutiful wife and peacemaker. She emphasized her loyalty, her reluctance to leave her children, and her commitment to Edward's interests, disguising her true motives beneath a carefully rehearsed performance. It was a masterstroke. The decision to send Isabella to France would become one of the most disastrous choices of Edward's reign. For the Queen had no intention of returning quietly. Though Hugh Despenser strongly opposed Isabella's departure, the mounting pressure of the Gascony crisis and Edward's genuine need for a diplomatic solution eventually overrode his resistance. The Queen's journey was presented as a diplomatic honor, but in truth, it was meant to be an extension of her captivity, carefully managed from abroad. Her household in France was hand-picked by Despenser, her mission orders crafted by Edward's advisors, and her movements to be closely monitored by loyal English agents stationed across France. But upon arriving in Paris in March 1325, Isabella, free from English surveillance for the first time in 17 years, began to shed the invisible chains that had bound her. The transformation was startling. French courtiers noted how she seemed to physically recover within days, standing straighter, speaking with renewed confidence, and no longer wearing the haunted expression that had marked her time in England. Charles IV and Queen Jean, recognizing both her symbolic importance and the trauma she carried, welcomed her not just as family but as a wounded soul in need of restoration. They offered kindness and respect, luxuries Isabella had not tasted in years. What began as a diplomatic errand slowly turned into an unspoken asylum. Isabella's letters home became increasingly vague, her political reports grew more critical of English policy, and her behavior gradually deviated from the constraints imposed by the English crown. She was no longer acting within the rules, she was rewriting them. Isabella's partnership with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English noble who had fled after a failed rebellion, was more than a romance. It was a calculated alliance between two people shattered by Despenser's tyranny, now united by a shared thirst for retribution. Their bond would spark one of England's most dramatic regime changes. Mortimer had escaped the Tower of London in 1323 and made his way to France. A battle-hardened soldier and shrewd political operator, he brought to the table everything Isabella lacked: military skill, insider knowledge, and no illusions about the brutality of rebellion. In return, Isabella gave Mortimer legitimacy, resources, and a royal name that still commanded respect. Their relationship, political first, romantic second, offered both of them something they'd never known: a partnership based on equality and trust. For Isabella, Mortimer was the first man who didn't see her as a pawn. For Mortimer, Isabella was more than a queen, she was an intellectual match, a strategist shaped by years of royal manipulation. Planning the invasion of England took nearly a year. Isabella used her status to secure funding from Flemish merchants, hire German mercenaries, and negotiate with discontented French nobles. She proved herself surprisingly capable in organizing the military logistics of rebellion, carefully assembling a lean but powerful force. Before setting sail, she launched a propaganda campaign that reframed her actions not as treason, but as the noble effort of a mother fighting to save her son's inheritance. The narrative resonated with English sentiment. Instead of a queen breaking her vows, Isabella became a protector of the future king, a role medieval society revered above all else. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed at Suffolk with an invasion force of roughly 1,500 men. Small in number, but symbolically immense, they represented not just armed opposition, but the gathering storm of popular outrage against Despenser's tyranny. Edward II, paralyzed by fear and clinging to Despenser, failed to mount a defense. He fled west, abandoning the capital. London opened its gates to Isabella, and within weeks, her forces controlled the heart of England. The king's flight revealed how far his authority had collapsed. Retribution and the fall of a tyrant. In November 1326, Hugh Despenser the Younger was captured. The queen, once powerless to stop her own humiliation, now held his fate in her hands. His trial was legal in form but political theater in truth. Charged with treason, corruption, and undermining royal authority, Despenser's true crime was what he had done to Isabella. She presided over the trial in person, ensuring every detail of his betrayal was recited for all to hear. The sentence, death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the cruelest punishment for a traitor. But Isabella ordered that he be kept alive as long as possible throughout the ordeal, reversing the quick executions he had granted his own enemies. She watched from a raised platform as Despenser died, her face unreadable. Edward II's fate required more delicacy. As both her husband and the father of the heir, he couldn't simply be executed. Instead, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. At Kenilworth Castle in January 1327, the ceremony was staged to appear voluntary. Isabella stood firm as her disgraced husband knelt before her allies and surrendered the crown. He was then imprisoned at Berkeley Castle, out of sight and disconnected from any potential supporters. His death, in September 1327, was officially attributed to natural causes, but few believed it. Rumors of foul play swirled, and though direct evidence remains elusive, Isabella's involvement is strongly suspected. Whether she ordered the murder or simply ensured the right conditions, Edward II's death removed the last obstacle to her power. The she-wolf ascends, and falls. From 1327 to 1330, Isabella ruled England in all but name. With Mortimer as her partner, she governed as regent for the young Edward III. It was the only time in her life that she held true power, and she wielded it with confidence and theatrical grandeur. The regency began with pragmatic decisions. She ended the costly Scottish wars through negotiation, securing peace and financial gain. Her grasp of foreign policy showed she understood that ruling was more than ceremony, it was about survival. Observers remarked on her transformation. She stood taller, spoke louder, and dressed with calculated elegance. Her rich garments now conveyed command, not captivity. She and Mortimer ruled together openly, dispensing with the usual pretense of a platonic alliance. Their public intimacy was risky but liberating. Isabella had hidden her heart for too long. But power bred resentment. As Edward III neared adulthood, the justification for Isabella's regency weakened. Courtiers and nobles, wary of Mortimer's growing wealth and authority, whispered into the young king's ear. He listened. In October 1330, Edward III struck. With the help of loyal nobles, he stormed Nottingham Castle in a surprise coup. Mortimer was arrested, Isabella detained. The queen who had dethroned a king now faced her own son's wrath. In a heartbreaking reversal, she knelt before Edward, begging for Mortimer's life. He refused. Mortimer was executed for treason. Isabella, spared by blood and royal title, was sent into retirement. Isabella spent nearly 30 years in quiet exile at Castle Rising in Norfolk. She lived in comfort, receiving generous pensions and occasional visits from Edward III, who treated her with formal courtesy, but kept her far from power. Her final decades were a retreat. She attended family events, gave to charity, and found solace in religion. The once feared she-wolf became a faded relic of another era. Historians have wrestled with her legacy. Contemporary chroniclers painted her as both a loving mother and a dangerous rebel, unable to reconcile a woman who defied every role society expected of her. Modern historians are more understanding. They see Isabella not as a villain or a saint, but as a woman who survived unthinkable cruelty, and learned to fight back with the tools of her oppressors. When she died in 1358 at the age of 63, she was buried at Greyfriars in London, dressed in the same gown she wore on her wedding day half a century earlier. That choice was hauntingly symbolic. The frightened girl who had arrived in England at 12 was laid to rest as the woman who had brought a kingdom to its knees. Isabella's tragedy lies not only in her fall but in what her life reveals, how royalty stripped young girls of humanity, turned them into instruments of state, and then condemned them when they resisted. She was not merely a queen, a mother, or a traitor, she was all of them, and something deeper. A human being, shaped by a brutal world, and one who dared to shape it in return.